The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Story of Rosa Parks by Mr. King. Our story begins in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, deep in the South, and at one time the capital of the Confederate States of America, and today the capital of Alabama. The city of Montgomery, like many southern cities, had local laws and ordinances that limited the freedoms of African Americans, in effect creating a segregated society. These discriminatory laws had been in place in places like Montgomery since the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And in particular, and I think you can see here on the map, that Montgomery is located in the Deep South, and that's where our story begins. As you can see from this picture of a bus from the time period that we're talking about, that is the 1940s and 1950s, buses were segregated, and this was the case throughout much of the South. And you can see that there was a white section at the front of the bus, usually consisting of about 10 seats, and then a section at the back, middle to the back of the bus, reserved for African Americans, usually consisting of about 26 seats. And what one needs to look at is that, in fact, African Americans comprise the bulk of ridership of public transportation. That's, I think, in large part because whites primarily owned cars. African Americans did own cars, but not to the same extent, so relied on public transportation much more. So there are a couple things that we want to talk about. African American passengers naturally had to sit in the African American section. However, the bus drivers, all white, had the authority to expand the white section only if it filled up and additional white riders got on the bus. And drivers could ask and or order African Americans to give up their seats so that whites could sit. And this is really what we're going to see happening on December 1st, 1955, when we talk about Rosa Parks. One of the other things that African Americans had to do was they had to get on the front of the bus, pay the fare to the driver, then get off the bus, and then move to the back of the bus and get back on the bus. And a lot of times, drivers that were not so nice would allow an African American to get on and pay, and then as soon as the African American got off the bus, the white bus driver would speed off, thus leaving the African American having paid a fare but with no ride. So there were these discriminatory practices, and it really kind of left the African Americans feeling powerless and trapped in a society. They needed the transportation to get from home to work and from work back home, but they were subjected to this treatment by obvious racist drivers and a racist society that tolerated this. Now, African Americans had tried to challenge some of these rules in 1954, but their efforts produced no results, and the white city council and the white mayor really kind of blamed the move to end these segregation practices on efforts by outside black agitators. And at some point, the idea that these agitators were affiliated with the Communist Party, so we might even see a connection here to the Cold War. But at any rate, white society really kind of refused to give in to any demands on the part of blacks to end some of these discriminatory practices, and that's where we're going to see the story of Rosa Parks begin. So here we can see a picture of what I believe to be Rosa Parks on a bus, though not necessarily the day on which she launched her action. And below you can see a plaque today that is in the city of Montgomery commemorating Rosa Parks for her action. So the date is December 1, 1955, and I think it's important to say that without prior planning, at least to the best of our knowledge, Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress, that is, a woman who worked in the garment industry sewing clothes, altering clothes, and she worked at a downtown department store, mending clothes for white customers, and she did this all day long, standing on her feet, very taxing job physically. And on December 1st, 1955, she got on the bus after work to travel back home. And she actually passed up one bus that was already too full because she really was tired. Her muscles ached and she really wanted a seat. So she waited for a second bus that eventually came along and had fewer people on it. So she sat in the section reserved for African Americans. However, lo and behold, a number of white people got on the bus, and the driver, a man by the name of J.F. Blake, at one point ordered Rosa and 3 other African Americans to vacate their seats in the African American section so that a white man could sit down for his ride. 3 of the African Americans reluctantly obeyed Blake after Blake threatened action, but Rosa Parks simply said to the driver, "Mr. Blake, no." That's all she said. She had had a long day, her muscles were sore, and she refused to move and give up her seat. At this point, J.F. Blake, the bus driver, got off the bus, found a phone booth nearby, and phoned the police, who promptly showed up and arrested Rosa Parks for violating the bus segregation rules. Now, she was, and we're going to see this in the next slide, so let me stop here. So here we see Rosa Parks as she's being arraigned by the police and fingerprinted. She was then fined, and Rosa Parks had a number of friends. She was active in the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and she had befriended several white people, and one couple in particular came to her rescue, posted bond, and she was able to get out of jail. But this is really the beginning of the movement, and you can see here this white officer, don't know his identity, but at this point, this is really the moment and the opportunity that African Americans were going to seize to make a point about the unfair and unjust practices that they had been living with, that they had been suffering for decades, really going all the way back to 1877, as I said earlier. And in this case, we're going to see that Rosa Parks becomes the first prominent figure in what became known as simply the movement, and that is the civil rights movement, and that's how we refer to it today. But at the time, I think it went by the simple term, the movement, that sprang up as a result of Rosa's arrest. And this movement that began in Montgomery, Alabama, would, within a decade, spread all across the South, bringing sweeping changes to the laws and practices of southern states, of southern cities and communities, but would also involve the entire nation. As Americans began to read about these events and see them, that were in other words, they were photographed and reported in major newspapers all across the United States. So we see that this is going to really kind of spread, and it's one of the great success stories that I think reminds us that the human fight for justice and fairness runs deep, and despite suffering and mistreatment that African Americans had clearly suffered for decades, we see that there was power in one individual, a woman named Rosa Parks, who had never really stood out before, had never done anything of great import before. And it reminds us that individuals, although ordinary, can have an extraordinary influence on bending the arc of history towards a more just, tolerant, and inclusive society. And I think that's what we want to focus on. We want to really understand that individuals can and do often, though they don't know it at the time, bend the arc of history, and they make America, simply put, a better place. They help America live up to its ideals that we celebrate every 4th of July with Independence Day, and that's the day that Thomas Jefferson and his declaration were proclaimed for the first time in 1776. And in that declaration, you might remember that Thomas Jefferson states that all men are created equal, and that all people have this natural given right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that this is one of those great moments in history that deserves our attention, because it was a moment that opened the door again to the idea that all Americans, regardless of their race and even their gender, I think deserved that life, liberty, and happiness, and that we're all created equal in the eyes of God and or nature. And that was something that we're going to see, and we'll see later in the next slide. So news of Rosa Parks' arrest spread very quickly in the African American community, and local activists, and in particular ministers, and it was often the ministers of the African American churches who led the movement to demand and to fight for recognition and to fight for justice and fairness. And you see in the upper left-hand part of the screen a man named E.D. Nixon, and he was a local preacher and civil rights activist in Montgomery, Alabama. And he organized a meeting the day after Parks' arrest to discuss a response to the situation. And at a very tense meeting, Nixon was sort of not well liked because he was very aggressive, he was very outspoken, and some people disagreed with his outspoken ways, and they said, "You're just inviting trouble for African Americans." So at this very tense meeting, Nixon kind of calls out all the other ministers and leaders, and he said, I quote, "I'm just ashamed of you. You said that God has called you to lead people, and now you are just afraid and gone to pieces because some man tells you that newspapers will be here and your picture might come out in the newspaper," end quote. So Nixon is calling his fellow ministers and leaders, he's calling them out, telling them they're cowards, that they are afraid that their picture might appear in the newspaper and that they might be criticized and or subjected to white retaliation for challenging the segregation laws. In the audience, however, and at that meeting, was a young 26-year-old preacher who had recently arrived in Montgomery with his wife, and he took up the challenge. He responded to Nixon's call for a leader, and his name was, I think you can guess, and you see him pictured there, Martin Luther King. And he was named at that meeting the president of what became the Montgomery Improvement Association. And this association was going to lead the response to Rosa Parks' arrest, and it was going to organize and carry out a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. So this is where we see Martin Luther King really coming on to the stage of history. And he accepted this role sort of unwillingly. He didn't really want to do this. He had just really gotten his career going after spending years in school at the age of 26, thinking about family and just being a good minister in his church in Montgomery. But he really couldn't resist the call to do what he would call the Lord's work, God's work. And so he's going to lead this almost year-long boycott of the buses, and it's going to be a very successful movement. But what you see here pictured is King delivering one of his first speeches, his first major public speech, I think, at the Holt Street Baptist Church to a congregation that was very excited about what he had to say. And it's at this point that King made very clear that the boycott was an action that was going to be nonviolent and was aimed at achieving simply the basic rights that King felt all Americans, black and white, deserved to enjoy. And King, on this occasion, said, and I quote, "If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer and never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie." And he concluded by saying these famous words, "And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." These were powerful words that gave lift to the boycott and would inspire people to endure almost a year without using the buses. And I'm going to pop over to the next slide. And you're going to see that, in fact, people without buses often had to walk. Now, one of the things that African Americans did was, as this became more and more publicized, the Improvement Association received donations from all over the country. And with those donations, they were able to purchase automobiles, and they began to organize carpools. Now, that was great. However, the Montgomery police, all white, began to target the black carpool drivers and riders, stopping them for various infractions and violations that were minor and insignificant, but it was an attempt by the white community to put an end to the boycott. But nonetheless, the African American community is able to resist, and within a year, there was a court case, and the Supreme Court itself declared on November 13th, 1956, that bus segregation was unconstitutional. And so we see that the Montgomery bus boycott, the first battle of the movement, was a clear and resounding victory for the right and for justice. And many more battles were to come, but I think this is an important beginning to a movement that tried to make America whole and to help Americans see that it had an obligation to live up to its founding ideals as articulated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. Thank you.